handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er 8 9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEPT. Gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you could join us. I got a really smart fellow with this. I'm almost beyond humble to have him with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, and that's Dr. James Robbins. Now, Jim is a senior fellow for the National Security Affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council. He's on the advisory board at the National Civil War Museum. That has to be a fascinating thing. He contributes to the Washington Times, one of my favorite publications. He's a professor at the National Defense University and special assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Woo! And an accomplished accomplished author. So, Jim, thanks so much for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Hey, Denise. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you've just finished a book, which, ladies and gentlemen, you can pre-order over at Amazon. And the book is Erasing America, Losing Our Future by Destroying Our Past. And so thank you for writing that. But ladies and gentlemen, Erasing America, pre-order over at Amazon. Jim, thanks so much for writing this book. I'm happy that somebody did. To watch what happened in the past year with the destruction and the removal of icons and statues and monuments. And I would argue with a lot of people not even knowing the real history of some of those things is, I don't know, for the first week it was criminal. After that, I was like, well, we can't stop this, can we?
Well, that's a good question. Can it be stopped? It started with Confederate monuments, and then as President Trump predicted, it quickly moved on to other things such as Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. We recently had Stephen Austin coming under fire in Austin, Texas. They want to rename that city. And it's part of a broader assault on American history and identity that's been going on for a long time.
Well, I decided after, the Civil War monuments and statues went down, and the left said, this has to be done. All was going to be peaceful after that. Everything was going to be peaceful in the world. We weren't going to have any more of these demonstrations or these protests or these rallies. That wasn't their mission anyway. It was just a byproduct, correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, the thing with the Confederate memorials, and, by the way, I'm a Yankee from Ohio, so, just to get that out there. The thing about the Confederate memorials was it was just sort of low-hanging fruit for the left. It was something that anybody who said, hey, I object to you tearing down that statue, they would say, well, you must be pro-slavery then.
Or
if
racist,
you're defending, a Robert E. Lee monument, or here in my hometown in Virginia now, where I live now, where they're taking down a plaque to Robert E. Lee and one to George Washington. Because, he was a bad guy too, I guess, right? George Washington.
Sure he was. Yeah, of course. And we're going to rename schools.
Oh, sure. Schools, street names, anything. And again, it starts off with, oh, we're going to rename the Jefferson Davis Highway to something else. Okay, fine, go ahead and do that. And then pretty soon they're vandalizing Thomas Jefferson's statue at UVA, the college he founded, on his birthday. So, it's, again, the Confederate thing is just the thin end of a wedge that goes all the way up to, as one person suggested, blowing up Mount Rushmore.
All right, Jim. So we've come to this moment where anything is a target. And I would argue that some of these people that are, part of this, I'm going to call them a gang, were probably very poorly educated on U.S. history coming up through the ranks of middle school and high school and probably even secondary education. Would that be right?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's where it started. And we're talking about decades ago when American history sort of veered away from its original mission, more of a civics mission of teaching good citizenship, and into a mission of social justice. And so kids stopped learning about all of the great things that happened in this country as a country founded on the idea of liberty and freedom, and became more focused on the grievances of certain minority groups or other groups. And kids learned less about the heroic history of our country and more about the kind of blame game history of all of the bad things that happened.
Jim, in your daily circles and in your daily work over at the Civil War Museum, at the Secretary, at the Defense Department, the National Defense University, do you have these discussions with any of your colleagues on this very topic?
Well, I don't work for the government anymore, but when I did work for the government, say teaching at National Defense University, history was a very important part of our curriculum for various reasons. For example, we would visit the Gettysburg battlefield with groups of officers, take staff rides there, and not only talk about the command issues of trying to fight a battle at Gettysburg, but also more of the historical context. Why was that battle being fought? Why was that war being fought? Things like this. And you kind of have to look at all sides of these issues in a very open way. I know that these days universities aren't exactly open to ideas. If you say the wrong thing, then you're going to get ridden out on a rail, which is kind of the opposite of what teaching is supposed to be. But in our environment, when we talked about these things, you could say anything and no one was judging anybody. It was just trying to understand what happened.
I find it, what you have done by writing this book, Erasing America, you're actually replacing, I would say, or at least preserving, if you will, history that's not being taught anymore, and some of those reasons. It's almost like you're doing a public service. Did you feel that motivation when you were writing it?
Yes, definitely. I think it's important to question where we're going with bringing up new generations where they don't teach a positive view of the history of this country. And I start off the book sort of musing about a future in which people don't even know about America, or if they know anything about America, it's all the negative stuff. Mm-hmm. All the things you hear from progressives about this country. Oh, our country is racist, and we're imperialistic, and we're capitalistic, which to them is a very bad word, and all this other stuff. I mean, fill in the blank with whatever ist you want. And if that's all that's being taught, then why would anybody care about this country? Why would anyone think America is exceptional or a good thing or in any way to be admired? And so if you start from the point of view of the progressive, that this country is just basically evil, it was founded on evil things, then why should anyone care about America or love America?
And yet, when you compare America to the mother country, if you will, to Britain, and you go to some of other peace parts of Europe, there's not really an attack over there as far as our education system, is there?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, America's bad, but are they teaching and telling and shouting that Britain was bad, Germany was bad, Italy was bad? I mean, are they teaching that? I mean, that everybody was bad, or is it just America?
Oh, well, I think this is actually a pretty broad movement in the Western world to self-criticize and condemn. I know that there's a lot of this in Britain, where people look back on the history of the empire and say, oh, that was a terrible time. You know, I'm sure we can romanticize the Victorian era or something like that, but then people focus on all the bad stuff that was going on. I think it's a pretty general trend in progressive thought to just condemn anything, you know, from your own country, and then to glorify things from elsewhere. And, you know, I got to tell you, the world has a lot to offer, but there's really no place like home. And it's one thing to say that there are good things that we can take from the world. I'm sure that there are, but you know what? There are a lot of really bad things out there too.
Indeed, there are. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with James Robbins, who is the author of the about to be newly released book, Erasing America. Jim, is there a priority on what the ultimate damage would be? I mean, is there going to be some kind of a damage assessment? Is it changing the culture? Just changing the history, or some kind of connective tissue? Or is it just going to, I mean, is there one more important than the other by what is happening here?
It's really a broad assault. I mean, I invoke George Orwell in 1984 in the book because I think really that's a good model for what the other side, you know, the American hating side wants to do, is really change our understanding of our history. I mean, the facts are the facts, but the important thing is how you interpret the facts. And I mean, they're not above just changing facts. I mean, I know that. I mean, they'll just rewrite a fact at will. But changing our understanding so that everything that we traditionally have looked back at and admired and revered become things that we should despise. And once you clean the slate like that, then you can write anything you want on it. And, you know, what they want to write on it is kind of like, make America Venezuela. In your spare time now, Jim, I think you're going to have to get on social media, because this generation, that's the only place that they learn anything. So I think you need to develop a phone app that would be downloaded that you can drop in every day some real facts that were probably overlooked. That's probably the only place that we can go to kind of re-educate. Would you think? Because once they're out of college, even if they got through it, there's nobody out there to reteach them. Because I don't think that there's some segment of the population that wants to go understand how wrong they are by reading Erasing America. Did I miss the mark on that one? Well, you may be right. I would hope that people would still read books, or, you know, do something to educate themselves beyond just reading their Twitter feed. You know, I think Twitter is like one of the worst things in the world. But hopefully people can delve more into the facts. I think that the overwhelming sense of cynicism that I see amongst some young people anyway is very negative and detrimental to the country. And when you're trying to essentially put out a good news story, because really, I mean, the ultimate conclusion of the book is try to be positive about this country and look at all of the good things about this country, and that our history of freedom and liberty and progress and technology and everything, I mean, it's a great story. And people need to focus more on the good things about America than just constantly harp on every negative thing that ever happened.
Is that ultimately, Jim, patriotism, which is something that we really don't, one, teach, or two, encourage anymore?
Well, I'd say it's a type of patriotism. I mean, we're kind of beyond, in terms of sinking down, we're like way beyond the point where you can just say, my country right or wrong. I mean, now just we're trying to get some basic understanding of the purpose and all the goodness of America. It's just reestablishing the factual basis is where we are right now, because it has been under such attack.
Mm-hmm.
The people don't even know, I mean, suddenly all of our heroes are villains.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's at least get back to the point where we can establish why we thought they were heroes in the first place.
Well, there was such an unknown, even for our founders. They had it. I mean, there was no way they could necessarily see into the long-term future. But I mean, the risks and the valor, and the commitment, the conviction that they took, I would say, is bravery beyond whatever common definition we know. Would you think so?
Oh, for sure. I mean, they risked everything to give us this wonderful legacy of freedom that has been nurtured generation to generation ever since. And I point out that even during the Civil War, when we had the two sides fighting each other, both sides look back to the founding generation as their heroes and their inspiration. That's one of the big differences between then and now. I mean, even though then the country was divided in two,
mm-hmm.
both sides looked back to the founding as being a good thing. Today, when we have these great national divisions, it's a much more fundamental division than even then, because one side says that the founding was great, the Constitution is this wonderful document, and so forth, and the other side would basically toss it all into a garbage can and want to start over with their own, socialistic, social justice warrior mindset. And that is highly damaging, because if it ever came to that, I mean, if they, somehow win back all the branches of government, they will just push through a radical agenda that has no relationship to what America is supposed to be.
I see what we have here is kind of a non-armed revolution that's going on. But I'm going to do something interesting and ask you this question. Next week, you are scheduled to be on The View, and you need to be prepared for a Whoopi Goldberg or a Joy Behar and hand them your book. What, Jim, would be your presentation for the probably 90 seconds you might get before you get thrown off the set?
Oh, that's a good question. But I think what I would have to do, in the unlikely event that happened, that I was booked on The View, is just try to stress the positive, because that's really what I'm trying to do in identifying all of the negativity that's coming out of the progressive side, the inaptly named progressive side. Just try to stress the positive, like what's wrong with saying good things about America? Mm-hmm. What's wrong with it? And then see if the bitter old crones on The View have an answer to that.
There are heroes, countless. I mean, going back hundreds of years. And I would argue that probably 90% of them haven't even been fully identified, much less named. And then we have heroes today, but the progressive left never even mentions them, even gives them some kind of accolade. It's almost as though we're not supposed to have them. And as a consequence, we don't have some kind of a legacy that we can endure on or appreciate. So I think that's the ultimate message of your book. Did I get that right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that the heroes of the past should be the heroes of the present, and for the same reason that they were heroes, because they did heroic things, and they've given us a legacy worth preserving. But the people who want to tear them down don't believe in any of that. But it's not just an academic exercise. I mean, this is the danger. It's not just reinterpreting the past for the sake of the past. It's doing that in order to be able to control the present and the future. Because if they can destroy what the framers put together, with basically destroying the Constitution, destroying America, that's the real agenda. That's why it isn't just Confederate monuments. It's way beyond that. It's everything.
All right, Jim, I'm hoping for a good answer to this one. Is this just a passing trend that's going to fade away?
I would hope so. It's really hard to say. I see some things going on in the country that are very disheartening. In the government, the undermining of President Trump and things like this. I would hope that the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, hasn't gained so much power that the voice of the people can't be heard. It seems to me that the progressive reaction to what's going on in the country, not just President Trump, but, Republicans control the Congress. They control record numbers of state legislatures and governorships and stuff. I mean, there's a definite trend towards people wanting to get back towards a fundamental understanding of what the country is, but the progressives' response to this is to kind of double down on hatred and violence and mean speech and stuff like this, with no attempt whatsoever to kind of question their own agenda, their own approach to things, or their basic unpopularity with the American people.
Well said. I hope this is just a fashionable thing that's going to fade away, kind of like the mini skirts or, the platform shoes. I'm just hoping that this is just a moment in time. And at some point, someone's going to kind of step in and maybe they'll go on to something else, and this one will just sort of fade away. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with James Robbins, who is the author of Erasing America, Losing Our Future by Destroying Our Past. And the book is pre-orderable on Amazon.com. Please go get it in a big way, because Jim lists an awful lot of things that are happening out there that did happen and continue to happen, as he just mentioned, Austin, and maybe renaming Austin, Texas, which I don't think will necessarily happen. But I would also say, no. Jim, too, and kind of in closing, some of these legislatures at the county, state level, they even get it wrong too. For us, some of these things to have been removed and gone to some warehouse in the darkness. Would you agree?
Well, yes. Many of the localities are controlled by sort of progressive Democrats. And the funny thing is that, particularly with the Civil War monuments, it was Democrats who put them up in the first place. And now it's Democrats who are protesting to have them taken down. I mean, in some ways, this is a civil war of the Democratic Party.
Well said, Jim. Thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Congratulations on the book. And I may tap you on the shoulder to come back again soon, because it's a riveting conversation and discussion. So thank you, Jim, and well done.
Oh, thank you, Denise. My pleasure.
More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. When it comes to all things legal and crazy things that go on in this country, my dear friends over there at Pacific Legal never let us down. So I've got the distinct pleasure of having Christina Martin with us, who is representing she and Mark Miller are representing a case in Florida, interestingly enough. And thank you, Christina, for being with us. This particular case really has somebody scratching their heads, and it's gone on so long. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about, is it Pasita or Pasetta?
Either way works. Pasetta is how we usually say it.
Okay, so Pasetta LLC versus the town of Ponce Inlet, which is over by Daytona Beach, correct?
Correct, yes.
All right, so is this case really going on since 2004, or was it sometime after that?
Well, the lawsuit started after that, but the Johnsons began attempting to develop land all the way back in 2004, and they worked with the town very closely. In fact, the town encouraged them to expand this modest development that they had been looking at doing, a retirement home for them to live in, their dream home, you could say. And some possible additional developments just to help pay for it, and some a little bit of housing, and so they did that for several years. They worked with the town very closely. The town was loved the plan. Johnson's made this large-scale development plan with the town's blessings, and gave the town everything it wanted: a public river walk, a public pier, a nature walk, land dedicated for archaeological digs and whatnot, and public parking. It was really something. And then the town, the political winds shifted. The town changed its position, and then rather than simply stop the development and require something more modest, the town went much further. Instead, they banned the development that they'd been discussing, to the point of amending the charter, the town charter, and then they went further than that, and they made it so that the Johnsons could not develop any of the vacant waterfront parcels, 4 of the parcels, 4 out of the 10 parcels that they acquired, and said that because the trial judge found that the town itself wanted to purchase the land at a steep discount.
Christina, how many acres are we talking about?
I think it was something like 16 acres. They had started out with something much smaller. They'd purchased 2 parcels of land, and then when the town said, "Hey, we love the idea of you developing here because we know you've developed elsewhere, and so we want you to do something bigger." So they purchased all these additional parcels required for the type of development the town had in mind, and then only to have the rug pulled out from underneath them. And essentially the town instead decided to devalue many of these vacant parcels because they wanted to drive them into financial distress and get the land at a discount.
So the Johnson family, if you will, or the Johnson or the Pacetta LLC, which is their business, you know, they worked really quite diligently, and not only for their own benefit, but really for the town. I mean, it costs a lot of money in doing engineering and architects to kind of draw up all these things and then have things approved, and the city was kind of working in cadence with them through all of this. I mean, the city, as you said, encouraged them to make this investment. So
absolutely,
you know, they're just trying to be good stewards of their little town, correct?
Correct, and that, you know, that's not me saying it. That's the trial judge who heard this case several years ago. That was his finding, and they spent millions of dollars. They hired lawyers. They hired planners. They purchased additional land to make this beautiful development possible. But the political winds shifted, and that's fine. But the town went too far when they denied the development, and it really, I think that, I mean, there's so much that happened here, and so much of it is, I don't want to get bogged down by the details, but the bottom line is the town went too far, especially when they were trying to intentionally devalue the land so that they could purchase it at a discount.
And so, is this just a town? Is this a county? Is this an EPA thing, a state EPA thing? I mean,
local government, yeah. It was local government. And interestingly, in Florida, we've seen a lot of cases where local governments essentially want to get something for nothing. They decide they like some land, and they want to either impose a public use on that private property without paying for it, or they want, you know, a public use like allowing the public to go recreate on the land, or they want to devalue it. There's been several cases where local governments have tried to intentionally devalue land so that they can get it at a discount. And ordinarily, that's recognized as a taking, as a violation of our constitutional property rights. But in this case, on appeal, so the Johnsons won in the trial court. The trial judge saw this was a taking. But on appeal, the Court of Appeals said, well, we need more information. We can't decide on this alone. There's other pieces of land that were not devalued, and so maybe it wasn't a taking at all.
We have things that were changed. I mean, there was zoning that was changed. There were permits that were given. I mean, we're talking about seawalls and all these other kinds of things, including a marina, correct?
Sure. So there was already an existing marina on one of the pieces of land that they purchased. So they acquired several pieces of land because they were working with the town so closely, and they came up with this great plan, and everyone thought it was great, you know, for a while, that is. But then, so they could have continued the marina use, but these other pieces of land that they purchased, that they paid quite a lot of money for, and one of them even had previously been permitted for townhouses. They weren't built, but it had been permitted to build a number of townhouses. The trial judge found that the local government was going to prevent all use of that land for anything other than a public park. And but because there's these other parcels that have some use left, like the marina, for instance, and there's a restaurant on one of the parcels that they acquired, because those pieces of land still have some value, the appellate court said, oh, well, we don't know if there's a taking of those pieces of land that can now only be used as a park. There might not be a taking, so we're going to remand it. And of course, we think that's wrong, and we've asked the Supreme Court to review this case and hold that when government intentionally targets land and tries to devalue it so that it can get it later at a discount, whether it's through condemnation or through a fire sale on the courthouse steps, from driving someone into bankruptcy or something like that. Either way, that should be a taking. That should be constitutionally barred. And when government does that, well, they should have to pay the value before they devalue the land, if you understand.
Yeah. And so the family or the business, the Johnsons, essentially won a $30 million judgment. And
right.
Then we have this appeals court that went, no, can't have that. And so the Johnsons are out kind of out of funds in two realms, correct? Their initial investment and then their judgment.
Well, yeah. So they were awarded compensation for the loss of value to 4 out of their 10 parcels, several acres of land, and much of it vacant waterfront land. They were awarded compensation for that because the court found that the local government had taken that property by intentionally devaluing it so that it could buy it later. In other words, the court was saying, look, you have to buy this. You can't just simply
take it.
Take all the value of it and then say, well, we didn't do that. But on appeal, what happened was the trial court, they said that it's not clear, you need to consider more factors. And on top of that, now this is important for people to understand if they want to understand how difficult it is to win in many courts. The court said, well, we don't even know if they could have filed this takings claim when they did. They might have done it too soon. Maybe they should have spent more time trying to get permits. And so it was remanded, and on remand to the trial court said, basically followed the instructions of that court and agreed that there's so much more you have to do to what we call ripen a takings claim. In other words, they should have filed more permits. They should have done more before filing this claim. And of course, this is very frustrating for property owners because here you have a situation where the trial judge had already found, in fact, there would be no economically viable use allowed for this land. But Florida court, the Florida Appellate Court said that's not enough. You need to show there would be no use allowed of the land.
What is the Harris Act?
The Burt-Harris Act is a property rights protection we have in Florida that essentially says when government inordinately burdens property, that you have to pay, you have to compensate people for it. And it's an additional protection on top of our constitutional protections. And actually, they raised the Harris Act claim and had won in the trial court. But when the town appealed, the appellate court had overruled that finding as well. So what the appellate court said there was, well, this big, huge mixed-use plan was not allowed under the comprehensive plan. A comprehensive plan is sort of like it's the overall plan that your local government adopts about what's going to be allowed in the future, right? Well, the town had taken a number of steps to amend that plan, and at the last minute, they changed their mind. But the appellate court said that wasn't enough. You can't have an inordinate burden in those circumstances, even though the Johnsons, they were working hand in hand with the town for a number of years and spent quite a lot of money. I think that the court missed it. I think the court was wrong about its interpretation of the Burt-Harris Act. But that's another fight for another day. Unfortunately, the Florida Supreme Court rejected that appeal.
So this initially happened, I think, in 2004, and then somewhere around 2010, maybe, that the political winds all changed. And I guess I'm trying to get a timeline on this. Is this thing about 6 or 7 years old now?
It was, yeah. So they worked hand in hand for about 4 years to 2008, and then Then they filed their initial lawsuit, and then the takings lawsuit was filed in 2010, and that's been dragging on now for 8 years. And then, after after a number of years of litigating this, the court said, well, you need a new trial because we don't have enough facts to decide whether this was a taking or not, or whether they should have spent more time working on more applications. And we just think that's unreasonable. The Johnsons did everything they should have had to do under the law to bring their takings claim. They, the town knew very well what their plans were for the land, and they didn't want any development of the land. That's what the trial court found. And the appellate court did not question that. Instead, they simply applied the wrong version of takings law. We think it's out of step with what our founders had in mind when they wrote the Fifth Amendment, and when during the Reconstruction, when the 14th Amendment was written. We think that this is out of step with the spirit of the Constitution, and we're asking the Supreme Court to review it for that reason.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Christina Martin at Pacific Legal, who has taken this case. Did the Johnsons, you said at the beginning they were going to build their own home and then kind of develop some of these other parcels to help pay for some of it. Did they ever get to build their own home?
No.
Oh. So they're living in like a mobile home or something?
No, I'm not sure where they're living. That's a good question. I should ask them where they're living. But yeah, so those developments were stopped. They were allowed to build some boat slips, which would have been worth a heck of a lot more had they been allowed to use some of this other land. Whether they could develop it going forward in the future, I guess it is going to depend on one, what's the Supreme Court going to do, and two, what's the local government going to do? And I think a lot of the times when we talk about property rights, people forget just how important their local government is when it comes to protecting property rights. We often see that local governments trample all over property rights and give very little regard to the Constitution. There are some good governments out there that don't do that do protect your rights, but there's so many that just ignore the burden that they're imposing on property owners, ignore the steep loss that their regulations impose on property owners. And in this case, of course, they went much further. According to the trial judge, again, he said that the town intentionally devalued the land so that they could get it at a discount. In other words, they were shrewd, and they had a plan of acquiring that land for much less than it was worth.
But the Johnsons already owned it, correct?
Right, they owned it, but the Supreme Court has recognized that when the government takes away the use of your land...
Oh, undertakings, okay.
Sure. Yeah, when they take away the use of your land, it can be like taking the land itself.
So when you say take this to the Supreme Court, are you talking about the Florida Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court?
The U.S. Supreme Court. We're asking the U.S. Supreme Court to review this case. We already asked the Florida Supreme Court to review it, and they chose not to. So we're hoping the U.S. Supreme Court will review it and fix this. This is a problem that property owners really everywhere face when local government regulates their land to the point that its value is lost. It's very difficult to get your case to the point where you can actually file a constitutional claim, because so many courts have said, well, maybe you need to file more applications. Maybe that plan was too ambitious, even when it's consistent with the zoning regulations. And it's extremely expensive to prepare these applications. People forget that. So ultimately, it makes it very difficult for regular people to file takings claims, to file these constitutional property rights claims, because they can't spend all the money required to apply for all these different kinds of permits in the first place. And so they have a piece of land that should be worth quite a lot, but because they can't spend all the money to ripen their claim and go to court, their rights are really meaningless.
This was all done, not just necessarily, Christina, on a promise. There's paperwork. There are permits, and there are probably minutes from town council meetings, and I mean, so there's a paper trail in all this. So it was really more than just a promise to the Johnsons, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there were. The town did quite a lot to help them along in this process. They had a public hearing where they presented the entire plan. They were working on amending the comprehensive plan and approved it on I think it was the first reading, but on the second reading they changed their mind because of the political changes. There was an election in the town, and there were some new people elected to the town council, and so there was quite a lot. And they also, they had these initial permits to prepare the development with boat slips and seawalls and whatnot. So they made these investments on the understanding that the town was going to let them get a reasonable use out of this vacant land. And rather than simply say, well, this one part of it isn't consistent with the comprehensive plan, we're going to require you to come back with something more modest, they instead tried to devalue it. And unfortunately, that should, it should be enough to go to court and win. But Florida courts have made it very difficult, along with many other courts, to enforce your property rights. It's almost impossible for anybody who's a regular person, a middle-class regular person, to do this. And so you end up having very few of these kinds of cases make it that far. Because the Johnsons, they spent quite a lot of money. And I'm not going to say they're middle class. I don't know exactly what their status would be considered, but they spent, millions of dollars. They took out loans, and they were experienced developers. Everyone thought this plan would go through, only to discover the town was going to stop all development of these vacant pieces of land, 4 of these large pieces of land.
How long has Pacific Legal had this case?
We took it over. We took over the appeal to the Supreme Court. We asked the Florida Supreme Court to review it, and we are now asking the U.S. Supreme Court to review it. It was handled by private attorneys. We often take over cases like this because property owners run out of steam. It's very, very difficult and expensive to enforce your property rights, and so it limits the sorts of situations where the Supreme Court even has the opportunity to review cases like this, because property owners can't outlast the government, because unlike the government, they don't have unlimited resources.
Mm-hmm. And what's kind of interesting, it looks like this town, Ponce Inlet, is going ahead with whatever their own agenda is, because I'm sitting here reading that even as recently as in the last few days, they're already dredging the Ponce Inlet. So, the water is deeper. Other boats can get in there. Now you got the people that go and use the beach. They're flipped out about, what kind of damage it's going to do to the beach. They've got the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who got a $8.5 million contract to do this dredging. So it's almost and this is all in Volusia County, correct?
Ponce Inlet? Yeah, that's Volusia County.
Yeah, so this looks like they're just kind of dismissing it all, and they're just going to keep on going. It's really kind of a remarkable thing that this isn't in the headlines all over the state of Florida.
Yeah, it really should be, because I think everybody should be worried when local government is targeting property rights. As far as dredging and all of that goes, I'm not really sure how that'll affect the Johnsons. I guess it just depends. I guess it depends on what happens. I suppose if they lose in the Supreme Court, maybe the locals will have a change of heart and decide that it's time to finally respect the Johnsons' property rights. But of course, they're now still out all these years of use of these parcels, and so it would at least be a temporary taking. In the truth, objectively speaking, whether they can win in court is always another matter. It's very difficult to win property rights claims. In fact, an empirical review of takings claims under the Fifth Amendment, the property rights claims, has found that fewer than 10% actually win. And yet people continue to bring them because our rights, everyone understands how important our property rights are. And so people are willing to take that chance because it is a fundamental right to use your property.
Well, I mean, and they're using their property. It really is a benefit to Ponce Inlet, to a town. I mean,
sure.
it was like a partnership. It
would have been, yes. Had the town let them follow through, then it would have been a benefit to everybody. But unfortunately, the town didn't. And you know, if the town wanted to change course, they should have been the ones to, they should have bought the land. They should have done the right thing and bought the land, and they could have turned it into a park with no economic uses. Instead, they just regulated it and refused to accept permits for a number of years, and the Johnsons instead have had to bear that burden of this land going unused. Well, I guess, Christina, a park doesn't generate any revenue. If you sell off the parcels and you make them condos or villas or boat slips or whatever else, there's a tax base. There's a property tax base that goes along with that. So, I mean, the whole thing is screwy. It is. But unfortunately, a lot of the times people just have an anti-development mentality. A lot of people don't like change. So if they move to a town that's small, they want it to forever stay small. I was here first. I don't want anyone else to come here. And that, I understand the temptation of that view. I was born in a very small town. I get it. But at the same time, you have to respect other people's property rights too. And if you want to live in the middle of nowhere, then you can't control, you can't devalue your neighbor's property so that you can do that. Go move someplace else if you want to stay small. I don't even know how a government could even begin to compensate this family, essentially going back for loss of revenue, or business. Emotional heartache. Yes, going back is really as far as 2005 or 6, maybe even 2007. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. And I'm so happy that you could share this whole takings rights or takings clause in the property rights, because I mean it is part of law that just escapes everybody. And so hat tip to Pacific Legal for handling this, and hat tip to you for sharing this. We'll keep a close eye and see where this goes to the Supreme Court. Probably won't be there till next year, right? No, if the court decides to hear it, it would probably be in this October. Okay. Yeah, this term, so it would probably be scheduled for maybe January or February. It's hard to say. Well, thank you, Christina Martin, and thanks to Pacific Legal Foundation, and come back again soon. Thank you so much for having me. All right.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. I'm glad you could stay with us. Got the distinct pleasure of having Paul Golden with us now. Paul is with an organization in Britain called Britain First. And we've been watching Britain First for quite some time. And poor Paul and Jada, both the directors of Britain First, have had some real legal issues, mostly because they just want to shut down free speech in the UK. So welcome, Paul, and did I get some of that right?
You got it. You got everything right there. It's good to be on your show, and it's good to speak to an audience in the US. We've got Britain First, as you probably know, has got an enormous audience and support base over in the United States, and always has. I'll expand upon that a bit later.
You sent out an email earlier that was calling for people to sign a petition to get rid of your mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. I guess the bigger question is, how did he ever get elected in the first place? Do you just have a bunch of citizens in London that just are negligent in their duty on voting?
No, it goes a lot deeper than that, actually. As you know, that Europe, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Australia, are all undergoing huge demographic change at the moment. The native indigenous birth rates have collapsed due to liberalism and feminism and so on. And because of the mass influx of third world immigration, lots of it Islamic, we are being gradually replaced within our own homelands. Now, London is a unique case because it's our capital city, has been for thousands of years. But about 10, 15 years ago, indigenous Britons became a minority in London for the first time in history. We're outnumbered now in our own capital city. And the biggest ethnic or religious group in London is Muslims. So Sadiq Khan is a symptom of a much broader problem, because I think out of the 10 top cities within the United Kingdom, I think 5 or 6 have got Muslim mayors now. And our second city, Birmingham, we're due to become a minority in that city as well, and it's going to be overwhelmingly dominated by Islam. In London, sensing the demographic shift, the Labour Party, which is the main left-wing political party in the United Kingdom, can be compared to the Democrats in the United States. They decided to take advantage of the millions of Muslim voters in London by putting forward the first Muslim candidate for London Mayor. And there is approximately 1.3 million Muslim voters in London. And when the polls closed on the London mayoral election in 2016, Sadiq Khan was elected with 1.3 million votes. So it was, very disturbing development. But our capital city is now run by a Muslim mayor who's, if you just Google Sadiq Khan extremist or Sadiq Khan extremism, you'll see article after article. This man is up to his neck in all sorts of Islamic extremism and left-wing extremist causes in the past. He's represented. He used to be a solicitor and lawyer, so he's represented some very unsavoury characters in the past. He spoke alongside known Islamic extremists and ISIS supporters at rallies and events. He's a thoroughly horrible little man. And in 2016, I had the honour of running for Mayor of London against Sadiq Khan on behalf of Britain First, our movement. And when the votes were counted, I had 105,000 votes just in London. This is the first time we'd contested a major election. We're running a constant campaign against Sadiq Khan. Under Sadiq Khan, at the moment, London's undergoing a very extreme knife crime epidemic, and there's teenagers in gangs being killed all over London on a regular basis, and he's doing nothing. We always refer to London as occupied London, because it's not really a British city anymore. Although you've got the landmarks and all that in the city centre, you can't in any way, shape or form class it as a British city anymore.
Well, Paul, it's interesting because we have a city in Minneapolis that appears to be going that same direction. And Then we have the state of California that is literally being occupied by illegals, and we have something called sanctuary cities, which is kind of like your no-go zones. Did I get that right?
No, the no-go zones I think are different to the sanctuary cities. Obviously, the sanctuary cities are the left-wing politicians running them are trying to make them into safe havens for illegal immigrants, etc. No-go zones in the United Kingdom are very different. And if you go to the Britain First website and look for our video library, you'll see some very disturbing activities that we've carried out over the last 5 years. No-go zones in Britain are very different. They're areas within London, within Luton, and various other cities or towns where there's really strong Muslim populations. Where there's certain areas where it's actually quite difficult or dangerous for non-Muslims to walk about. You know, there's been Muslim patrols in East London, very famous patrols, where Muslim gangs have walked around attacking revelers. One of them from the United States was beaten to a pulp and put in hospital. I remember that. Yeah, a famous video that's gone viral on social media multiple times. And there's parts of like Luton, for example, Luton in Bedfordshire. We've gone to a certain area called Bury Park, which is a stronghold for radical Islamists. And the police, we've been attacked, and there's been a big standoff in that area between us and the Islamic radicals. And then the police have applied to the High Court to ban Britain First from the entire town centre of Luton and the Bury Park area, and they were successful. So at this present time, myself and Jada Franson, we are the only, or the first in history, I believe, in British history, the first politicians to be banned from an entire town due to a High Court injunction. Me and Jada have also had an injunction put out against us not to enter every mosque in England and Wales, which is a legal jurisdiction. But yeah, I mean, there's certain areas of the United Kingdom. President Trump has pointed it out before, and a lot of people, mainly outside the United Kingdom, have had the courage to point these areas out. I've been into many of them and been attacked and dealt with Muslim gangs, tried to confront them, etc., etc.
Paul, has there been any kind of a hearing or any kind of testimony that's provided to any of your members of Parliament on any of this, or is this just the 800-pound elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about? Exactly how you placed it in the latter part of that statement. You're obviously aware of political correctness in the United States, but we have political correctness on steroids in the United Kingdom. Yeah, you do. Our political elite and the media and the establishment are so left-wing, so politically correct. Islam is essentially, and especially Islamic radicalism, is a protected species within Britain. Me and Jada, but Jada is now in a probation hostel as we speak, even though she owns her own house. She's in a probation hostel with a whole list of civil liberties restrictions. We've both just come out of prison because we had the temerity to go down to a town in Kent and confront an Afghan migrant rape gang that raped a 16-year-old girl. And despite the prevalence of DNA evidence and witness statements, etc., this rape gang was actually allowed bail. They was allowed to, while the trial was ongoing, they was actually allowed to mingle with the community. So we went down to Ramsgate and leafleted all their neighbours to let them know that at number 29, for example, there's a rapist on trial, an immigrant rapist, and the state reacted to our campaign by throwing us both in prison. And we've also got upcoming charges in Belfast and Northern Ireland simply for making speeches in the town centre. So you think you've got it bad in America. If you actually look at what's happening in the United Kingdom, it's a lot worse. It's situation's dark over here. Yes, it is dark, and we are watching that very carefully over here because what happens there seems to happen here about 6 months later. It used to be 5 or 10 years. Now that time is compressed. Paul, do you believe that Brexit, should Brexit ever happen, will be some kind of saving grace in all of this? I don't think so. I think that Brexit and the Trump phenomenon, and all across Europe, you've got patriotic right-wing movements, conservative movements like the Front National and
so on and so forth. They're just symptoms of a general decay and betrayal of the West by our establishment. So I don't think Brexit's going to change much, because unless Brexit removes the corrupt career politicians that are destroying the United Kingdom, then it's not going to have much. It's not going to change anything, in my opinion.
Well, you guys are really not a member of the European Union, correct?
We are at the moment. We're coming out next year, or so we're led to believe. But the way we're being stitched up with Brexit, we're going to be basically taking all of the rules from the European Union for many, many years. There's a huge uproar in this country that the European Union referendum outcome has been betrayed. Brexit's being betrayed, and it is, essentially.
Actually, that's what I meant. You are a part of it, but I guess I didn't say it right. What concerns me is that you've got a higher power. You've got a collective part of a government, run out of Belgium that is taken sovereignty from your country, correct?
That is correct, yes. And this is, a big part of left-wing ideology is internationalism. It's creating international bodies, institutions and governments to override national sovereignty. That's just part and parcel of communism, of socialism. So ever since the end of the Second World War, there's been these big moves to create these international institutions like the UN, the EU, you've got NAFTA in America, haven't you? So, yeah, the whole point of these projects is to remove national sovereignty, remove national identity, to create left-wing international superstates like the Soviet Union that basically ride roughshod over the population and institute socialism. And that's what the left is working towards.
And if you don't have an Islamic problem, you've got a Russian problem, don't you?
To be honest, I believe that the so-called Russian problem is just a complete smokescreen, and it's all nonsense, and it's all complete rubbish, to be honest. Because in my opinion, because Putin is relatively patriotic and essentially right-wing and Christian, and he's pushing those things, the liberal elites in the West are just in overdrive to try and blacken his name, destroy his reputation, and drag his name through the gutter. It happens to everyone. It's happening to Trump with the liberal media. It's happening to me, Jada, the Front National, everyone across the Western world, or in Europe or America or anywhere, that sticks their head above the parapet and stands up for their own people is ruthlessly demonised by left-wing elites.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Paul Golding, who is one of the directors of Britain First, along with Jada Franson. I've interviewed Jada, I think, a couple of years ago, prior to all of this other nonsense happening to both of you. But this movement where you're trying to get your population involved, and you're having to unteach them something and then teach them something else. This is a Herculean task that you've undertaken, and I'm happy certainly for it. But it's you guys have been arrested. Tommy Robinson's been arrested. You've got UK Unity that's going on. So you've got these movements. Is there some kind of countermeasure that's happening here outside of your law enforcement that is really hurting the traction that you're trying to gain?
Yes, in a nutshell. Unlike the United States, we don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have any kind of guarantee by law of freedom of speech, expression, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't exist in the United Kingdom. We only have the freedoms that Parliament allows us to have. A lot of people don't understand how the British political system works. Essentially, Parliament is supreme in the United Kingdom. If Parliament passed a law saying that Paul Golding has to be thrown off a bridge tomorrow, unfortunately it'll be law, and it'll have to be done. That's just the way it is. We're almost in a dictatorship of Parliament. Parliament is completely supreme. There's no Bill of Rights or constitution that kind of inhibits its power. It's only really curtailed by what they can really get away with, and eventually they'll start really cracking down on us and banning us and so on. But at the moment, what we're dealing with is kind of the soft power of the state. Britain First was founded 7 years ago, and there's 3 of us sat around the table, and that's how we started off. And since then, we've accumulated millions and millions of supporters all the way around the world. We actually built the biggest social media support base in Europe within a matter of 3 to 4 years, and the British establishment was completely freaked out by what was happening and what we was able to mobilise within the United Kingdom. But when I went to prison in March for harassing these rapists, supposedly, 4 days into my prison sentence, I was watching Prime Minister's Questions, which is a regular thing we have in Parliament every Wednesday. And it was announced by an MP that Facebook had announced that they were closing down all of our Facebook pages and banning us from the platform, which didn't really surprise me. I knew it was going to happen one day because we was just getting too big and too strong. We was reaching like 10 to 20 million people across the West every single week. We was reaching far more people than the BBC, for example. We was a real power within the media, just with our Facebook pages. But over the last, ever since we started locking horns with Islamic extremism, specifically 4 or 5 years ago, the state has just done everything possible to try and bring us to heel, try and lock us up. I've been to 3 different prisons. I've been attacked by Muslim gangs in my cell recently when I was in prison. I've been arrested 20 times. I've been prosecuted 5 or 6, 7 times. I got high court injunctions, bad bail conditions. They're just using every single trick on the book, and they're just mercilessly targeting us 24/7. They try to try and derail us from what we're doing, because it is being successful. We are waking people up. We're offering people a way out of this quandary that our country is now in. And the end result is, though, that people like me and Jada have to live a life of extreme stress and pressure from the establishment, from the state, from the police authorities, and so on. They treat us like we're terrorists and murderers, and they'll prosecute us on the most flimsiest. The most flimsiest evidence imaginable, on the most Mickey Mouse small time offences. But they'll give us bail conditions, or they'll give us restrictions that are fit for murderers and terrorists. We're always in and out of court. We're being sued, and it's just a constant battle against the authorities. And like I say, people don't realise that there is this kind of, I think that the term you use in America is deep state.
Yes.
Yeah. In Britain, we do have a deep state. We've got the Home Office, we've got the security services, the intelligence services, all very cloak and dagger. No one knows what they're... Unlike in America, where you've got a lot of institutions and public bodies are public domain institutions and accountable. In this country, we don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have the kind of real civil liberties protections that you have in the United States. So they're just getting away with a lot more over here. I mean, for example, these... me and Jada have just been to prison for charges of harassment. And if you just forget the circumstances of what we were charged and the actual offences themselves, harassment is a very, very low level, very basic magistrates issue in this country. Very, very basic offences, very low down the scale of seriousness. But we was prosecuted, investigated by the SO15 Counter-Terrorism Command. They're the top anti-terror organisation, law enforcement agency in this country. But they're the ones who led the investigation against us. They're the ones who are in court making statements against us. So we're living in a country now where there's 23,000 known Islamic extremists walking the streets, where there's hundreds and hundreds of ISIS fighters returning from Syria, all battle-hardened, being given free council houses, yet me and Jada are the ones being targeted by our top anti-terror police. So,
yeah, and I just read, I think a week or so ago, Paul, that you've got 80 Islamic extremists that are in prison that are supposed to be released in December, and you don't have an infrastructure that can watch these people, or are they going to be on probation, or are they reconnected? I mean that into itself, because they were given such light sentences, I would say is a brewing national security problem for Britain, correct?
Absolutely. And I actually, when I was released from prison in Liverpool, HMP Liverpool, I was met at the gates by 2 carloads of plainclothes SO15 Counter-Terrorism Command officers. And they escorted me all the way down to London. And I was thinking to myself, why on earth is the government deploying 2 carloads of their best anti-terror police to act as taxis, to act as a taxi for me to take me down to London? Well, it's totally unnecessary. But when I was in the car with them on my way down the motorways to London, I was actually talking to them, and the intelligence services are foiling something like 1 serious terror plot a week. And I was saying to them, you know, regardless of what your superiors get you to do, harassing me and Jada, they are doing a fine job. They're doing a very, very good job in keeping a lid on the absolute avalanche of terrorism that's being directed against Britain. Because I said to them, even if just a quarter of these terror plots actually succeeded, we would have a civil war situation on the streets of Britain. They said, absolutely. We're run off our feet. You know, we're overwhelmed at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I did say to them, you know, isn't it a bit silly? Your superior's sending you to babysit me.
Yes.
The taxi for me. And they did the same with Jada as well. 2 carloads, picked her up from prison, took her away to a hostel to live under supervision. It's just crazy what's going on.
Well, you know, Paul Golding, we certainly appreciate your time here on the Denise Simon Experience. You know, you're always welcome to come back because, I mean, it's something that, you know, Britain is an ally of the United States, and the United States is an ally of Britain. And I think there needs to be some real coordination among the little people like us to you know, make this message get some continued traction and continue to spread. I got to give you guys high praise for your courage and your stick-to-itiveness that you want to, you know, continue to call attention to this, especially when it comes to your mayor. And then, you know, the things that are going on in Birmingham and Luton as well. Even when you get over to, you know, other parts of the UK, you've got a Herculean task on your hand, and just know that there's an awful lot of people here in the United States that are standing with you. And is your website still viable at BritainFirst.org?
Yes, BritainFirst.org is our website. Unfortunately, we're actually on the verge of suing Facebook in the county.
I thought so.
Because in one part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, where Britain First is registered and have our addresses and offices, and shortly we're going to be back to being a political party in Northern Ireland. Political discrimination is highly illegal because of the peace process between the Protestants and the Catholics over there. So we're going to be suing Facebook for political discrimination over the next few weeks.
Well, come back again soon, Paul, and good luck to you. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We're in our last segment. We're going to go over to something that I think we can all smile about. And I have the distinct pleasure of having H.W. Crocker with us. And I think he has a brand new book that's hitting the newsstands like right now, and that is Armstrong. Mr. Crocker has written a series of books. And this one, we're going to take you a little bit of a different direction on the spirit of the book. So, H.W., thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure.
You know, in order for, a topic like Custer or any other book in that genre, you got to really love history. And because you've written a series, I would say that you're probably the go-to guy for certainly period work, correct?
Yeah, well, I would like to think so. I've written lots of books of plain old military history, books about the Civil War, books about America's military, covering the entire gamut of our wars, and cover some foreign wars as well. But I've also written novels, and this time I decided to do something I thought just for fun, but with some real history to it, and also a little bit. I mean, the book is satire, it's comic, it's funny, it's an adventure, but there's a little bit of seriousness to it as well. The book is called Armstrong, and its premise is this: that George Armstrong Custer, probably one of the most recognizable figures in American history, survives the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He survives Custer's last stand, and he's spirited away from the battle. And because he's so embarrassed, not to mention horrified at this disaster that has just occurred, he wants to try to clear his name. And until he can do that, he has to work undercover under a different name. So he takes on the clever name of Marshall Armstrong. And becomes this sort of Western do-gooder. But in the process of doing this, the book is completely funny. It's supposed to be just a good, adventurous read. Somebody online called it the dangerous book for dads with no trigger warnings.
That's cute.
And there is some of that, too. I mean, I think it is a book that any sort of reader of adventure stories could like. And frankly, I think it's a book that if a mom or dad read it, they could pass it on to their teenage son with no worries. But there's also this to it, which is that I really believe that American history, America's past, is under blatant attack. And we are having all sorts of myths foisted on us about how evil and corrupt and bad American history is, when in fact, it's a great adventure story. And I thought, we can argue until we're blue in the face about the facts of history and hit these arguments head on. But we're never going to really win these arguments unless we capture people's imaginations. Because for a lot of people growing up, what really shapes their understanding of history is not what they read in a history book. They get some of it from that. But it's movies and books and that's the TV shows they watch. And if you grew up in, say, the 50s or the 60s or even into the 70s, you probably grew up on a steady diet of of westerns and lots of patriotic American fare, and you have very different.
My favorite was Lonesome Dove, so there you go.
There we go. And so you have this sense of continuity with a great and heroic American past. But I fear that way too many kids today grow up with this idea that America has always been this racist, sexist, oppressive place, for which all of our ancestors were evil, brutal, genocidal maniacs. And unfortunately, Custer has been caught up in that. When this movement to take down Confederate statues, we've seen that it doesn't stop there. You've got people like Washington and Jefferson because they were slave owners under assault. You even have people like Custer under assault. Custer fought for the Union. Custer was the boy general of the Civil War. He became a brigadier general at the age of 23 years old. He was one of the great heroes of the Civil War. And yet, Custer was too controversial. He was on there was a goofy but harmless little Sonic, the fast food chain commercial that had this little tiny joke about Custer and custard. And there was this guy dressed up like Custer. They yanked that commercial after no more than a week because it was considered politically incorrect because Custer fought Indians. I mean, we are in the process of erasing our entire past, and it's not done for no purpose. The people who are trying to get rid of America's past or disparage it, it's because they want to replace it with something else. They want to, there's that old line, he who controls the past controls the future. And so this book, even though it's completely comic, a complete adventure story, it even has a talking dog in it. It's all for fun, but it's also to kind of get kids and adults back into the sense of our heritage of being a good and wholesome thing.
Well, I'm of the notion because it's about Custer. It's got satire and it's injected with facts that it would be a very good Broadway show. However, somebody's going to complain. I mean, I see this as being a very good piece of musical theater almost, but somebody like the TV commercial will take offense and stand there with their hands on their hips and stomp their feet. Would you agree?
Yes. In fact, it's funny you should say that because I just had a house guest this last weekend who read the book, and that is exactly what they said. This sounds like it could be on Broadway. It should be like a Broadway musical.
I wasn't the house guest.
No. But of course, it really is absurd that we've heard these stories over the last several weeks about Trump administration figures being chased out of restaurants and they can't do. And it is true that to take a traditional American patriotic, let alone conservative view of our past, is to be considered persona non grata. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an obvious example of this is I'll give you one that's personal now. I just found out this morning from the sales guys at the publishing house. This is coming out from a mainstream publishing house. This is a book from a guy like me who's written lots of books before. I have written bestsellers. It's not as though this is like a nothing burger. The book was effectively banned on the West Coast. Barnes & Noble did not buy a single copy for any of their stores in Washington, Oregon, or California. And California happens to be not only my home state. I wrote speeches for a former governor. I mean, he was governor at the time, but I wrote speeches for the California governor for 4 years. And you're telling me that a book about the West is too hot for the West Coast? And apparently maybe it is, because Custer is too controversial, fighting Indians is controversial. I don't know. I mean, it really is. Political correctness has not gone insane, gone mad. There is no end to this. This is like a permanent revolution where things that you or I might take for granted as, oh yeah, that's American history, that's a good thing, are now considered, forbidden. You can't say that. You can't see that. You can't do any of this stuff.
Well, if you'd stamped a red stamp on the cover of the book and said Democrat, then Barnes & Noble would probably have accepted the book on the West Coast.
Well, I suppose this is actually an irony of this whole thing, because the more you get into history, it really is ironical. Like that, George Armstrong Custer was, in fact, a conservative Democrat. Uh-huh. George Armstrong Custer was, his patron was, in the Civil War, was General McClellan, who was a Democrat, who actually ran against Lincoln for president in 1864. And moreover, if Custer had not died at the Little Bighorn, there was some talk that he might become a Democratic nominee for president. Now, if he had run for president, he would have run, in fact, as a conservative, but his party affiliation was Democrat, which is one reason why Ulysses Grant didn't like him. Because Grant was Republican, and Grant's brother had some business interests out west with Indians, which were of questionable legality, and Custer was actually exposing some of the bad doings that were being done by these Indian traders out west. So he was a very controversial figure, not only now, but in his own time. But for most of American history, he was a renegade. But for most of American history, he was also regarded as a hero and a unifying hero. Because remember, here's this guy who is a famous Civil War general for the North, and yet he was friends when he was at West Point with many Southern cadets. He waged total war against the South, but at the same time, during the war, he attended the wedding of a Confederate officer who was a friend of his from West Point. He attended this wedding in Virginia at a plantation house. The Confederate groomsmen wore gray. He wore his Union blue, and he stayed around after the wedding for about a week, flirting with the Southern belles. So, I mean, he was a very magnanimous man. He was all for reconciliation with the South after the war, and the South returned the favor, because here's something that many people forget about Custer. People think of him now as the great, or maybe the not so great, Indian fighter because he got killed at Little Bighorn. But yes, he fought Indians, and yes, he fought Indians brutally, just as he had fought Confederates brutally, but he actually liked Indians. He loved his native scouts. He said, you put this in writing, look, if I were an Indian, I would much rather lead my life on a horse on the open plains than be put on a reservation. He was actually sympathetic in both cases to his enemies, but he felt it was his duty to execute these orders he had, to fight them to the best of his ability. But he was not a genocidal maniac. He was not a vicious, hateful murderer. And in fact, after his death at Little Bighorn, the newspapers in the South, and this is only 1876, Little Bighorn, so 11 years after the end of the Civil War, a war that cost 600,000 lives and devastated the civilian population of the South, because of course that's where a lot of it was fought. Their newspapers were among the most articulate and also angry, and saying, let's avenge Custer. Let's avenge Custer. So his former Confederate enemies were the ones who most wanted to go avenge Custer's death. Well, I will say there were some newspapers in the North where there was already some of this, well, maybe we should leave the Indians alone sort of thing, who were more tentative.
Do we officially know who killed Custer?
No. Some Indians there were certain Indian individuals who said they did, but the accounts are all conflicting. In fact, a lot of the battle, this actually sort of plays into the novel in a way. The idea that he survived the Little Bighorn is, of course, not true, but it is plausible enough because it is sort of a mystery. A lot of what happened there we don't know because it was a massacre. So there are differing accounts. There are both Indian accounts. There are accounts from other units that were involved, and two of his two leading commanders, a man named Reno and a man named Benteen, both survived and could give their testimony. But Reno was a coward and incompetent who was 3 times court-martialed after the battle and finally kicked out of the army. And Benteen, who was more competent but he had a personal animosity to Custer. So they were not really reliable witnesses either. I think we also forget, because a lot of people take, to my mind, a sort of perverse view of this. They say, Custer had it coming. He just charged in there to serve what he got. In fact, Custer was a much underestimated strategist and tactician. He was actually, he didn't become a brigadier general for no reason at all at the age of 23. He was a major general by the end of the war. He was actually a very good officer, a very courageous officer, a very instinctive, intuitive officer. But more than that, he was very loyal. And this is not a matter of patronage, it's a matter of loyalty. His inner circle of friends and family, many of them were at the battle and died with him. Two of his brothers died with him at Little Bighorn, as did his young nephew, who was named after him, as did his brother-in-law, who was known as the Adonis of the 7th Cavalry, because he was this amazingly handsome guy. It's really, the tragedy of Little Bighorn is something I think that has been completely drained from the story, because too many people now think that they take this sort of view of Custer had it coming, or they see it as a great offense. The whole the Indian War is a great offense against the Indians, sort of an American genocide and that sort of thing, which is, I don't think supportable by any reasonable reading of history. I think Custer is not only a tragic figure in that sense, he's also a great American, I have to say, lovable, boyish figure. He's a guy who came from a humble background, made his way to West Point, graduated last in his class, not because he wasn't smart, but because he was a prankster. He was so good-humored. He was playing practical jokes all the time. In fact, on the day he was to graduate, he didn't actually graduate with his class. He was court-martialed because this was his last act at West Point. A fight broke out between two cadets. And rather than breaking it up, as he should have done under his duties, he decided to referee the fight to make sure it was fair. So he was court-martialed for this, for this act. But he went straight from that court-martial to the front lines of the Civil War. And he was a famously loyal and devoted husband. He was, again, a very good humor guy. He was like a Saint Francis when it came to animals. I exaggerate this in the book to comic effect, but he could command any horse. He loved dogs. He was always surrounded by dogs. He kept a pet field mouse in his inkstand. He was just a really colorful, interesting, likable character. And the fact that he's now become, so attacked as either an arrogant, crazy maniac or, a genocidal monster is just, it's really sad. And you think of these guys who devoted their lives to the betterment of this country, to defending this country, and their memory, which was once cherished, is now tossed in the gutter.
Well, he's clearly a very studied military officer. He's clearly every bit of that. And so you have taken all, in this book, Armstrong, you have taken a snapshot of his life and injected some real facts, but you have put some real, wit and humor to all of this, and necessarily rightly so, because he himself was somewhat of a prankster and a renegade, correct?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, that's all true.
And so he died young. What was he, like 36, 37 years old?
Oh, that's a good question. He must have been, because he must have been, in his middle late 30s.
Now you mentioned his family, HW. So what's the fallout with the family?
The most important fallout with the family, and the one that was the most famous to Americans at the time and to historians, is his wife. His wife, Libby Custer, never remarried. And she became known essentially as Custer's widow, and she lived for a very long time. She kept the Custer candle or shrine lit for the rest of her life, and wrote several books about her life on the plains with Custer.
Was that in Ohio?
He was born in Ohio, but grew up in Michigan.
Okay.
She was the daughter of a judge in Michigan, in Monroe, Michigan. And this is actually the part of the story, is that Custer, coming from his dad, was sort of a blacksmith / farmer. Her father, Libby Custer's father, was of a much higher class as a judge. And so he didn't approve of this match when it was first being knocked around. The idea was being knocked around. And he was even less approving of this when he once saw Custer staggering down the street drunk. But because Custer knew he had embarrassed himself in doing that, and because he was so ardent to win Libby's hand, Custer took the pledge. He took a vow to never drink again. So Custer swore off drinking. He swore off gambling, which he used to love. And he swore off harsh language. I think on that last point, he did not always maintain his vow. But on the drinking, he certainly did. And on the gambling, I think he mostly did. Mm-hmm. And again, the book sort of plays off this as well. It plays off this vow he made. But it's just, for a guy who was regarded as so impetuous, and he is sort of like an Errol Flynn-like character. Both Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan portrayed him in the movies. He was also, pretty darn dutiful too. And when he took a vow, whether it was to the Constitution or to his wife or to anything, he was very serious about keeping it. Keeping your word was extremely important to him.
And so there's, again, we say that he's a very studied military officer. And so I would even think today that, some of those attributes that you just listed would absolutely overshadow the reasons that, say, Barnes and Noble on the West Coast won't buy the book. I mean, it is, there was a book written about Custer just a couple of years ago, which won a Pulitzer Prize. I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's called Custer's Trial or something like that, or the Trials of General Custer. I can't remember the exact title, but in any event, I would say, here's a book that won the Pulitzer Prize. I would say the book is only okay, and in some cases, it's actually unintentionally laugh out loud funny. And it's laugh out loud funny because it is so over the top politically correct. So this book that is supposed to be, that pretends to be about, and is about George Armstrong Custer, an inordinate amount of it is taken up with the Custer family cook. Oh my God.
Because she happened to be black, and because he wants to play off both this race angle and this woman angle about her versus Libby and the power relationship between the two of them. And you're thinking, what the heck? This is how I want to read about General Custer. And you're talking about all this sort of, feminism and racism and stuff, which is just, injected into the story to make it, I fear, palatable to the people who control all these, the people who control the media and academia who are very politically correct, and those who pursue a more traditional view of history, or for this matter, in this case, historical fiction, don't get the same sort of attention.
HW, how is it that you inject some humor and satire? I mean, if you go inject, insert, can girls and all these other kinds of things. I mean, where does how do you do that? How do you take a piece of history? Because I'm sure there were some fun facts, but you're just making. How does that work?
I will say the book is a mixture of fact and fiction. It's mostly fiction. There are some surprisingly hidden facts in there about his background. Some of the things he actually says are adapted from things he really said in real life. And what it really does is it exaggerates some of his characteristics. So it exaggerates his power over animals. It exaggerates. Even though he was loyal to his wife, he was a flirt, and it exaggerates his attraction to women, though he's very innocent. And it's just really a matter of exaggeration. But it's also, to my mind, the thing is, Custer is like a bit like Teddy Roosevelt in this regard, is that they are in their own way walking caricatures of themselves. You think of Teddy Roosevelt; he's got the glasses and he's got the big teeth, and he's charging up San Juan Hill. So you can do an affectionate portrayal of him that's funny just by sort of exaggerating his natural features. So too with Custer, you think of this impetuous, blonde locks flowing, kind of over the top heroic character, yes. And you just sort of take that a little bit further, and you have a really funny character who's still likable and admirable, and really, and I have to say, pretty true to life, despite the exaggeration.
Did you put Hugh Hefner in here for?
No. I will say, though, there are, for those who want them, there are lots of plays on words or references to old westerns, or in some cases even very hidden westerns to pop culture, or even some political things. But that, you can either get those things or not get them. It doesn't matter. The main thrust of the story, the thrust that will sweep everyone along, is it's a big adventure story, and it's a big adventure story with lots of humor.
Well, congratulations. And this is in a series, your most current production, correct? I mean, you've got several books under your belt.
I've got several books under my belt. For this series, I have to say it all hinges on book one. This is book one of a projected series of Armstrong adventures, where Custer goes from one adventure to the next. So I've got book two all mapped out, but from the publisher's point of view, it all depends on whether this one sells. So if this one sells, yes, book two will be on the way. If it doesn't, I guess I'll have to go do something else.
Well, the title of the book is Armstrong, and what's fascinating is he's got a tattoo on his bicep on the cover of the book.
Yes, that's actually the guy who did the cover did a brilliant cover, but I wanted him to put that on there because I thought it'd make a great jacket, but also it's part of the book. It's an early scene in the book that happens to him. He gets forcibly tattooed by the Indians, but I went back and rewrote that scene after the artist did the jacket, because he did the jacket even better than I could have imagined. But yes, that's sort of the spirit of the book. It has got this sort of.
Well, congratulations, Harry, and ladies and gentlemen, run out to Amazon and go grab this book. We all need a lot of humor in our lives right about now, and H.W. Crocker has done a stellar job in the book titled Armstrong. Happy that you could put some humor in it. We all need it. We all need a good laugh, and the fact that you injected some real facts in there is a big help too. So congratulations, and thanks so much for your time here on the Denise Simon Experience. And ladies and gentlemen, it's been fun being with you, and we'll see you again very soon.